Captain Lyra Quinn stood before the massive holomap, her eyes scanning the projected lines of the human colonies scattered across the galactic frontier. The room buzzed with the low hum of the command center, an efficient, sterile place where every second counted. Her team, the Special Forces Unit, was assembling for what was supposed to be a routine training exercise, a refresher for the newly recruited soldiers. But that was before the news came. "Captain!" Lieutenant Harlan's voice cut through the silence, breaking her concentration. He stood beside the comms console, his eyes glued to the screen. "You need to see this." Lyra turned, her boots clicking against the polished floor as she walked toward him. The lieutenant didn't look up, his gaze locked on the incoming data. "What's going on?" "Renoxian ships," he said, tapping the screen. "They've been spotted near Human Sector 4. We intercepted a transmission. They're preparing for something big." A cold shiver ran down Lyra's spine. The Renoxians weren't just a neighboring empire, they were the galaxy's oldest and most feared species. Ancient, powerful, and ruthless, they had crushed countless civilizations with ease. For centuries, humans had barely been a blip on their radar. But now, things were different. Humanity was on the rise, expanding across the stars, and the Renoxians had taken notice. Lyra folded her arms, her face hardening. "How big are we talking?" "Fleet of over 30 ships," Harlan replied, the tension in his voice betraying the calm exterior. "Battleships, cruisers, and a few destroyers. They're moving fast. They breached the neutral zone." Lyra's heart quickened. "Prepare my team. We're heading out." Before Harlan could respond, a voice came over the intercom. "Captain Quinn, urgent communication from command." Lyra pressed a button on the comm panel. "Quinn here. This is General Draxos." The voice boomed from the speaker, a mix of authority and restrained panic. "We've just received confirmation. The Renoxians have launched a full-scale assault on Colony 9, the bastion of humanity's frontier in Sector 3. Lyra's blood ran cold. Colony 9 was the heart of the human expansion in that region, home to thousands of civilians and military personnel alike. It was a major supply hub, a strategic point that the Renoxians would undoubtedly target to break human influence in the sector. "General, we're already on our way. What's the situation on the ground?" Lyra's voice was steady, though her mind raced. Her forces had trained for this, defending human colonies from the unexpected, but never against a force this large. "Colonel Bray is leading the defense," General Draxos replied. "But the Renoxians are overwhelming them. We need your special forces in the field. You'll be going in ahead of the main fleet to assist. You'll have a full battalion at your disposal." Lyra's thoughts flashed to her soldiers, her team. Her mind went over each of their faces, young, eager, yet battle-hardened. She couldn't let them down. "We'll handle it, General," Lyra replied before cutting the comm. "Harlan, prep the transport. We leave in 5. The lieutenant nodded sharply. "Understood." As she turned toward her unit, Lyra took a moment to let the gravity of the situation sink in. The Renoxians weren't just another enemy, they were a force of nature. Their war machines were legendary, their tactics brutal and efficient. And here, on the frontier of human civilization, Lyra and her team were about to face them head-on. The transport was ready within minutes. The hum of the engines reverberated through the sleek, metal hull as Lyra strapped herself into her seat. The faces of her soldiers were determined, but there was a quiet tension in the air. Each of them knew the stakes. This wasn't just about a mission, it was about survival. If they failed, humanity's foothold in this sector would crumble, and the Renoxians would strike harder, faster. Lyra activated the comm link, bringing up her second-in-command, Sergeant Jenna Klein, on the screen. Klein's face appeared, framed by the dim light of the transport bay. "Captain, we're ready to deploy." "Good," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. "The Renoxians are already on the move. We need to hit hard and fast. There's no room for hesitation. The fate of Colony 9 rests on us." "We'll do what we do best," Klein responded. Her words were short, but there was an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding that only battle-hardened soldiers possessed. Get the rest of the team briefed. We're moving out in 30. Understood. Klein out. Lyra leaned back, watching as the vast expanse of space unfolded outside the transport's viewport. The stars were distant, silent witnesses to the storm that was about to break. She thought about the families on Colony 9, mothers, fathers, children, waiting for help that might not come in time. If they failed, it wasn't just another military loss. It would be the beginning of humanity's fall. Hold tight, Lyra said to herself, clutching the straps as the transport shot through space. We won't let them take our world. As they neared the planet's surface, the first explosion shook the transport. The ground beneath them trembled, and the warning lights flashed red. Lyra didn't flinch. Deploy! She shouted. The soldiers filed out, falling into formation with precise efficiency, each unit knowing their role. The chaos of battle greeted them, explosions, the roar of gunfire, and the faint screams of resistance. The Renoxian forces had landed and were already pushing their way through the outer defenses. It was a massacre, but Lyra's team was different. They weren't just soldiers, they were humanity's edge. We'll carve our way through, Lyra muttered under her breath as she drew her weapon. And we'll make sure they never forget who we are. With that, they moved forward, the storm of war closing in. Lyra's boots hit the cracked soil with a resounding thud as she sprinted toward the command post. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning metal stung her nostrils. Explosions rocked the ground beneath her, sending tremors through the earth, but her mind remained focused, locked on the objective. Colony 9 was under siege, and it was her job, her duty, to ensure it didn't fall. Captain? Sergeant Klein's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. Lyra turned to see her second-in-command racing toward her, weapons slung over her shoulder, face smeared with dirt and sweat. What's the status? Lyra asked, barely raising her voice over the din of battle. We've established a perimeter around the eastern wall, Klein said, panting. But it won't hold long. The Renoxians are using plasma cannons to breach the outer defenses. They've got reinforcements coming in from the south. We need to move fast. Lyra's eyes narrowed. The Renoxian tactics were predictable, slow, methodical, and devastating. They didn't rush into battle. They wore their opponents down, using their superior firepower and relentless persistence. But humanity had something they didn't, the will to survive, to adapt. Get the team to the southern flank, Lyra ordered. We're going to intercept their reinforcements before they can reinforce the front lines. Klein nodded and radioed the rest of the squad. Lyra turned to face her unit, her family. These soldiers had been through hell together, and now, they were about to face an enemy unlike any they'd encountered before. There was no room for doubt. Listen up! Lyra shouted, her voice cutting through the clamor of the battlefield. We hit them hard and fast. No hesitation. We don't give them a chance to regroup. This is our home, and we're not giving it up. Move out! The soldiers responded in unison, a chorus of, Yes, Captain! As they scattered into formation. Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The Renoxian forces had underestimated humanity before. She was determined to make sure they wouldn't make that mistake again. The southern flank was a war zone. The sounds of gunfire and explosions filled the air, as the Renoxian forces advanced in a long, organized column. Their massive war machines, heavily armored and bristling with weaponry, cut through the landscape like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. Lyra's team moved swiftly, weaving through the chaos, their armor gleaming in the faint light. They were like ghosts, striking from the shadows. As they reached the edge of the Renoxian formation, Lyra held up her hand, signaling for them to stop. On my mark, she whispered into the calm. We breached their flank. The plan was simple. Get close enough to disrupt the Renoxian advance, create chaos in their lines, and force them to divert resources to counter the human threat. It was a tactic that relied on speed, precision, and most importantly, surprise. Lyra's pulse quickened as she surveyed the scene ahead. The Renoxians were distracted, focused on their march toward the heart of Colony 9. They hadn't expected resistance this far from the front lines. That was their mistake. Now! Lyra barked. The team sprang into action. Explosives went off on the Renaxian war machines, sending them into a frenzy. The air was filled with the screech of tearing metal and the acrid scent of burning fuel. A massive Renaxian tank, its armored hull nearly impervious to most conventional fire, erupted in a violent explosion, throwing pieces of shrapnel in every direction. Lyra charged forward, her rifle aimed steady. She took down the nearest enemy soldier, her shot clean and precise. The Renaxians, though advanced and fearsome, were not invincible. They were just like any other army, vulnerable to human ingenuity and determination. "Take them down!" Lyra ordered, her voice now a low growl. "Push them back!" Her squad moved with military precision, coordinating their fire to cover each other as they moved forward. They tore through the Renaxian ranks, their weapons blasting through the air, the battle unfolding with a brutal, fast-paced rhythm. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. Sergeant Klein led a charge toward an exposed Renaxian officer, slicing through his guards in a flurry of movement. The officer barely had time to react before Klein's blade found its mark, cutting through his armor with deadly efficiency. "One down!" Klein shouted over the comms, her voice fierce with exhilaration. "But they're starting to regroup. We need to move fast before they counter." Lyra's eyes scanned the battlefield. She could see the Renaxian soldiers beginning to regroup, pulling their forces together for a retaliatory strike. It wouldn't be long before the tide turned if they didn't act quickly. "Fall back," Lyra commanded. "Regroup and hold the line. We're not done yet." Her squad complied instantly, falling into position with disciplined precision. The Renaxians may have more firepower, but they didn't have the agility, the quick thinking, or the resolve of humanity. The battle raged on, with each side taking losses. Lyra's unit fought with everything they had, pushing the Renaxians back inch by inch. The intensity of the fight, the roar of weapons and the thundering explosions, was deafening. But through it all Lyra kept her focus. Every soldier under her command was a part of something greater. They weren't just defending a colony, they were proving to the galaxy that humanity would never bow to anyone. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the battlefield had grown eerily quiet. The fires from the Renaxian war machines lit the sky in a dull red hue, casting long shadows over the wreckage. Lyra stood at the edge of the field, staring at the destruction. The smell of smoke and blood was thick in the air, and the ground was littered with the remains of both Renaxian and human soldiers. "We held them off," Klein said, stepping up beside her, her face weary but determined. "But this isn't over. They'll regroup, and they'll come at us again." Lyra nodded grimly. "And we'll be ready for them. They may have the numbers, but we have something they'll never understand. The will to fight. The will to survive." Klein clapped her on the back. "Well said, Captain." Lyra's eyes hardened as she looked out over the battlefield, the stars above her shining bright with the promise of another day. "This is just the beginning." As the wind swept across the shattered earth, Lyra knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew one thing for certain: humanity would never back down. Not now. Not ever. Lyra stood at the edge of the battlefield, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on her shoulders. The skirmishes of the past hours had been brutal, but this was different. The Renaxians were regrouping, amassing their forces for one final push to break humanity's defenses. Colony 9 wasn't just under siege, it was on the brink of collapse. And Lyra's team was all that stood between the Renaxian war machine and total destruction. "Captain," Sergeant Klein's voice cut through the silence, "our scouts report the Renaxian flagship has entered orbit. They're preparing for a full-scale bombardment of the colony." Lyra turned to face her second-in-command. The fire in Klein's eyes mirrored her own determination, but there was something else, a hint of uncertainty, a question of whether humanity had enough to withstand what was coming. "We can't let them do it," Lyra said, her voice cold with resolve. "If they destroy the colony, they'll send a message to the entire galaxy. We're not just defending a piece of land, we're defending our right to exist. Klein nodded, but the tension in her posture didn't ease. What's the plan? Lyra glanced over her shoulder at the chaos unfolding in the distance. The Renoxians had begun their advance, their colossal war machines rumbling across the landscape like unstoppable juggernauts. The sky above them was a swirling maelstrom of smoke and fire, the once pristine atmosphere now thick with the stench of war. We don't have time to wait for reinforcements, Lyra said, her voice resolute. We're going in. All of us. Klein's eyes widened. Captain, the flagship. I know, Lyra interrupted, her tone unwavering. But if we don't take it out, the bombardment won't stop. This is our only chance. We're going to board the flagship, take down their command center, and disable their weapons systems. If we can neutralize the flagship, the rest of the fleet will be forced to retreat. There was a moment of silence as the weight of her words settled over the team. The plan was risky, suicidal, even. The flagship was a heavily fortified vessel, bristling with advanced weaponry and guarded by the fiercest soldiers the Renoxians had to offer. But Lyra knew they had no other choice. We leave in 20 minutes, she said, meeting each soldier's gaze. This isn't just a mission. This is everything. The transport was a blur of motion as it cut through the atmosphere, streaking toward the flagship hovering above Colony 9. Inside, Lyra's team was silent, each member lost in their thoughts. There was no fear, not anymore. Just resolve. They had faced impossible odds before, and each time, they had come out on top. This time would be no different. As the flagship grew larger in the viewport, Lyra's mind raced through the plan. They would infiltrate the flagship via its cargo bay, using the chaos on the surface as cover. From there, they would move quickly, taking out key systems before the Renoxians could mount a counterattack. Captain, we've got company. Harlan's voice came through the comms, snapping Lyra out of her thoughts. She looked up just in time to see a Renoxian interceptor squadron barreling toward them. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, Lyra ordered, her pulse quickening. The transport rocked violently as enemy fire splashed against its hull. The crew scrambled into action, weapons drawn and ready. Lyra's mind was already in the next step, focusing on the mission ahead. They couldn't afford to be distracted. The flagship was the goal. We're almost there, Klein shouted from the back of the transport. Hang on! The next few minutes were a blur. The transport weaved through the enemy fire, dodging Renoxian interceptors that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, but her focus never wavered. They were getting closer. When they finally touched down inside the flagship's cargo bay, the team immediately fell into formation. Lyra led the charge, her rifle aimed steady as she scanned the room. The bay was massive, filled with crates and supplies, but there was no time to admire the enormity of the ship. The enemy was already aware of their presence. Move out! Lyra shouted. The squad surged forward, cutting through the silence with the hum of weapons charging. They quickly neutralized the first wave of Renoxian guards, but the real fight had just begun. The sound of boots pounding against metal floors filled the air as they advanced deeper into the heart of the flagship. Captain, we've got company! Klein shouted as a platoon of Renoxian soldiers emerged from a nearby corridor, heavy armor gleaming in the low light. Their weapons hummed with lethal energy, and their eyes glowed with the cold, ruthless resolve of a species accustomed to conquering everything in its path. Lyra didn't hesitate. She moved forward, taking down two of the soldiers with swift precision. Stay focused, she barked at her team. We're not here to play games. Push forward. The firefight was brutal. The Renoxians were formidable, but humanity had something they didn't: unpredictability. Every soldier in Lyra's unit knew how to adapt, how to turn the tide even when the odds seemed impossible. As the squad reached the flagship's command center, Lyra could see the Renoxian general on the far side of the room. Zalterra. The same general who had orchestrated the assault on Colony 9. His face, covered in intricate scars, was a mask of fury as he barked orders at his subordinates. Lyra's eyes locked onto him. This was the moment. "Take him down!" Lyra shouted. The final confrontation was a blur of movement. The Renoxian guards were fierce, but Lyra and her squad were relentless. In the chaos, she made her way towards Zaltera, her eyes fixed on the general's smug expression. He thought he had already won. He was wrong. With a swift, calculated move, Lyra tackled him to the ground. Her weapon was at his throat in an instant. "You underestimated us," Lyra growled, her voice low and dangerous. "This is the last mistake you'll ever make." Zaltera sneered, but his defiance faltered. The fight had already been lost. Lyra wasn't just fighting for Colony 9 anymore, she was fighting for humanity's place in the galaxy. She pulled the trigger, silencing the general once and for all. As the flagship systems began to power down, the rest of the Renoxian fleet faltered. Without their command center, the enemy forces were left in disarray. Lyra's team had done the impossible. They had struck a blow against the heart of the Renoxian war machine. The battle was over. Humanity had won. Lyra stood amid the wreckage, her breath steady despite the chaos around her. The mission was a success, but at what cost? The colonies still smoldered in the distance, the scar of war etched into the land. But Lyra knew one thing: humanity had proven its worth. And the galaxy would never forget it.